Hi guys, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you once again for a Sunday session. I've moved in from the back deck this week. What I found was the lighting is a little bit dark. The closer we're getting to winter, the more the sun's going down. So going to be doing it from inside or maybe around about in the community from time to time. So this month's, these things keep going so quick. This week's session is choosing your strategy. It's one of the, elements that people seem to struggle with in the process. Spend a lot of time in not being able to lock down their strategy, and because they can't lock down their strategy, that tends to send them on a little bit of a wild goose chase and burning a lot of energy in the process. So I can see a couple of people have joined. I can see Luke, just trying to see, I can see Ray as well. It's telling me that there's a number of people on here, but I can only see 2 or 3 names popped up. There always seems to be a bit of a delay. A bit of a lazy Sunday this week. For once in a very long time, I've really just sat on the couch and watched the TV. So it's a very rare occasion when that happens for me. So have enjoyed it. If I'm a little bit doughy, I apologize in advance for that. Just going to give everybody a couple of minutes to come on, and while I am going to give everyone just a little bit of a heads up, because of the Easter weekend coming up, our normal meetup event in Brisbane won't be on the 3rd Saturday of the month this month. Instead, it's going to be next weekend. So if you are based in Brisbane, then we have brought that forward a little bit. We have sent some alerts out in that regard. Hopefully people are actually paying attention to that. I can see a couple more popping on. So hi Shelley, hi Michael, and a couple of others in there as well. Trying to think what else to give everybody a heads up on while we wait for a couple of others to jump on board. But I can see Dan's just jumped on as well. Hi Dan, how are you? What are some of the other upcoming events? So this week's event in a meetup in Brisbane is actually going to be me talking. So we had one of our industry specialists have actually pulled out. So it's actually going to be me talking this week. Sorry, I should say this month. And it's going to be a little bit complementary to today's session today. So today is going to be about locking in your strategy. And then the meetup is going to be then locking in your particular suburbs. So those two tend to work hand in hand. Once you know what your strategy is, then that helps you actually choose where your suburb's going to be. So that said, thought I might start the process. I guess everyone is starting in a different place. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a rounding, first of all, just to bring everybody into the same baseline. But the intention that most of us are coming into, I guess, the property development side of things is that in reality, we actually want to be getting to the point where we can actually obtain what is everyone refers to as financial freedom. The challenge is that everyone's concept or definition of financial freedom is totally different. And so I just want to do a little bit of a clarification on that as to what my definition is. So financial freedom is where you've got enough passive income to cover your debts. Now, if you do not have many debts, then you don't need a heck of a lot of passive income in order to actually obtain that financial freedom. What that allows you to then do is to say, well, if all my debts are being paid through passive income, then effectively I have bought my time for free, and then what I choose to do with my time is then completely up to me. So the goal of the objective is actually to obtain that financial freedom status, and there's a couple of stages that you need to go through in order for you to actually get there. Many of us starting out are actually challenged in the fact that we don't actually have any capital. So we can't actually go and buy things. And so one of the first parts to the equation, it's actually a little bit of a two-tiered approach. You need to actually build some capital and then convert that capital into long, ongoing passive income from there. So I can see a couple of other people coming on. So Sunny and Adam, hi guys, welcome aboard. Sunny, haven't seen you on here at all, mate. Welcome for the first one, and Barb's just joined as well. So welcome to that. So in order to get to those stages, it's really in order to build that capital stage as phase one of the process, we really need to get to a point where we actually have learnt a skill, and the skill that we want to do is the strategy that we want to choose. The challenge is that many of us don't choose a single strategy. We try to become, try to keep our options open, and the challenge with keeping your options open is you then need to learn more and more about multiple strategies, and the amount of effort that you burn actually gets quite tedious, and you don't get a lot of traction. So my guidance is to always choose a single strategy, get to know that one strategy really, really well. The way I figure it is you've got so much, you've only got a limited amount of time available to you, and how you choose to use that time, you can either spend that a lot of that time on multiple things. So if you're doing multiple things, you can not do them very well. So you're very wide and very shallow. Or alternatively, my approach is to get one strategy, keep very, very narrow, and go very, very deep. So the same amount of effort goes into that. So it's quite important that you choose that one strategy well early in that process. And the intention of that strategy in the early days is to build your capital base. My guidance in that regard is if you can choose a strategy that is in alignment with what your long-term goal is for your passive income, then that's going to make things very easy in the process. So if your intention is to own, multiple residential properties, then you should be doing some sort of residential subdivision. If your intention is to own multiple townhouses or a whole unit complex, then you should be trying to aim towards a unit complex or a townhouse complex. Now, that's always challenging in the early days because one, you don't have the time, one, you don't have the skills, and you certainly don't have the capital. And so what we need to do is then work out the execution strategy in how we actually get there. So once we build that capital base, then the intention is to keep some of those profits from some of those projects as our profit. And by way of example, if you're able to obtain a 20% profit out of one of your projects, and it happens to be, say, a 6-pack townhouse or a 6-lot land subdivision or something along those lines, sell 5 of them down, and the 6th one you keep as profit. Because you don't actually sell it, you're not actually paying tax on it, you will then actually own it outright, and it'll be able to generate you passive income. So that's really what we're trying to do, is actually get you to a position where you can actually own some of these assets along the way, rather than actually buying them resale. We're going to be manufacturing them wholesale. Now, there are tons and tons of strategies that can be executed. Everyone's going to have their own personal alignment as to where that sits. But if we go through some of those very high level, there's residential properties, and my guidance there is positive gearing, not negative gearing. You could also do things with multiple keys, so duplexes or dual occupancies, granny flats, auxiliary dwellings, that sort of thing. You could also do houses of multiple occupancy with rooming accommodation, boarding houses, Airbnb, etc. Or you could also go into the commercial space. Now, which one of those you go into, I will, give you some criteria to help you in that regard as we go. Hi, Adrian, just seen you jumped on board. How are you, mate? Now, it really comes down to what is your starting position. So everyone's starting position is going to be completely different. And so this is more a framework for you to actually start to capture your existing situation. So you should be capturing your assets and liabilities. So what properties you own, how much debt you have against all of those properties, what amount of lines of credit you might have available, what's your liquid cash, et cetera, et cetera. You want to actually go and do a complete audit of where you currently are to try and work out, based on where you are, whether or not you are able to do this on your own volition, or whether or not you're going to need to partner up with somebody along the way, whether it be through joint ventures, whether it be through vendor finance, or a number of other things like that. But you really want to understand where you're coming from in those early days. Now, in doing that, some of the things that you're going to be capturing with those assets and liabilities are obviously the asset itself, the entity in which you own it, which is quite important because you need to understand that as you're going through this, property development has some risks associated with it, and maybe the entity that you bought something in a legacy way might mean that that asset is actually in some form of risk during the process. So you want to take stock of what that situation is and see whether or not you're going to have an opportunity to change that entity, or whether or not, when you have assessed the asset, whether or not that's something you might strategically choose to jettison in order to improve your liquidity and your cash flow. So you're going to then understand on that asset what it's currently worth in today's market. You also want to understand how much debt you actually owe against it. And then when you start to accumulate all of those assets, then you're going to have a look at your total, I guess, net worth, and understand that for those assets that are able to be borrowed against, the bank will typically lend upwards of 80% against those assets. So you want to see how much borrowing ability you may actually have against those assets that you own, whether it be your principal place of residence, a legacy investment property, etc., etc. Now, in order to do that, one is the equity in that, and then two is have you got serviceability to take on any other loans. So once you understand that initial net position, then you're going to then take some decisions to say, well, do I need to, I guess, liquefy some of those assets in order to change my position? Maybe those assets aren't serving my long-term goals. So that's something to also understand. Once you've captured your assets and liabilities, you should also then be actually capturing your budget. This is something I find that many people actually struggle to do. As I said, for financial freedom to actually occur, you need to actually be able to pay your existing debts. But if you don't even know what those existing debts are, then how do you know what the goal is that you need to actually obtain in order to get there? So go and do a budget, actually capture everything that you've got along the way, understand everything from, what's your mobile phone bill, your electricity, your gas, your rates, your car rego, any rent that you might be paying, any rent that you might be receiving, loans that you're paying, etc., etc., school fees, clothing, if you're partial to some to regular extracurricular activities by going out and things like that. Capture all of that in that budget and actually understand where your current expenses lie, and determine whether or not some of those are lifestyle budget choices or whether or not they're essentials. And so what you may choose to do, and I'm not suggesting that you have to, but at least assess whether or not the expenses that you've got in the short term, you might be able to sacrifice in order to accelerate your wealth creation process. So when you go through all of those bills, you'll be able to see which ones of those are essential and which ones of those are lifestyle. That will then help you to understand what your borrowing ability is, because you need to understand, I guess, when you're going into these deals, how much assets you've got, how much liquidity you've got, and how much serviceability you've got. So those two steps in the early stages are going to help you very much to actually understand where you currently are in that borrowing capacity point of view. The next thing that you want to do is then understand what's the finish line that you're actually aiming at. So if you're looking at, I guess, a financial freedom goal, then once you understand what your debts are that you need to pay, then you'll know how many properties that you actually need to own outright in order to actually achieve that. So then that helps you to determine what that goal is. Then you can put together an action plan in order to achieve that. But then you're going to start to work out, well, is it 1 property, 2 property, 3 property, 4, etc., that I actually need to own outright? You'd be surprised when you actually look at how many of those things in your budget, the essential items, you'd be surprised at how many of them you can actually sacrifice, and you may be able to get away with owning only just 1 or 2 properties outright in order to, I guess, technically qualify for financial freedom. Again, once you're at that financial freedom stage, then from there, everything is, I guess, a matter of lifestyle. But at this point, you get time on your hands and you can do 100% property development rather than, I guess, 10, 15 or 20 hours a week, which many people are doing, which then allows you to accelerate that wealth. So once you understand what that goal is, you can then start to put together a little bit of an action plan as to how you're going to do that. And you'll look at the combination of your current assets, your current liabilities, and your budget to say, well, in order for me to do this using my own funds, then perhaps I can only do a certain sized deal, or alternatively, do I need to join forces with somebody else in regards to a joint venture? Now, I guess that's an acquisition part of the process rather than the strategy itself, but it's certainly an important part to the process. Now, when you're starting to assess what kind of deal do I actually go into, you're going to start to look at, well, the liquidity in running the deal is probably the most critical element in the process. So when you start to look at the liquidity of the deal, then certain kinds of deals need more equity than the next one. So if I've only got, let's just say, less than $50,000 in liquid cash, then chances are I can't actually go into a deal at all at this point in time. And instead, what I need to do is some form of no money down deal in order to actually start to build that cash base in order to start the process. Once I start to build that small capital base and I get it to the point where I've got, I'm going to say, 100 to 120 odd K, at that point, I can probably actually go into a deal. Now, if you don't have the capital yourself and you can still come up with 100K or 120K by joining forces with somebody else, then that's good enough as well. So, but it's really understanding that you have at least that in order to actually get into a deal. Excuse the traffic noise that just went past, my humble apologies. If you've got more than 100 odd K, then, so if I had 100K, then I need to only go into a small chunk deal. But if I've got more than 100K and I've got, say, upwards of 200K in the kitty, then I may be able to do a medium-sized chunk deal. And then if my kitty is even larger again, and I've got somewhere up to, say, 300K, then I might be able to do a large chunk deal. So the more money that I've got in the kitty, or the more access I've got to that liquid funds, then the more likely I am to be able to afford a small, medium, or large. Now, especially early in the process, I guess small deals are a lot less risky, medium deals are medium risk, and large deals are certainly a lot riskier. So you need to understand your risk profile to determine whether or not, just because you have the cash right now, if you don't actually have any experience, maybe you've got enough liquid cash to do a large deal, but if you haven't got the experience, then maybe you want to come down to a medium or down to a small chunk deal in the early days at least, in order to make sure that that you build your confidence, build your skills in that process as you go. So my guidance is, have a look at how much equity you've got and what your skills are. And I've got a little bit of a matrix that I put together for the guys that do my course. And depending upon the skills they've got and that access to liquid funds, we give them a risk category rating as to whether or not they should go into a low level risk deal, a medium level risk deal, or a high level risk deal. So essentially, if you've got lots of cash and you've got lots of skills, then you can pretty much go into any deal that you can take on, because your risk profiles are fairly high. Not your risk profile, but your ability to take on risk is a lot higher, so you can take those on. If, however, you've got a low amount of cash or you've got a low amount of skills, then you need to be a lot more cautious, especially in the early days, because you can't afford to lose that cash, and equally you don't have the skills or breadth to run that larger deal. So if you've got a combination of low cash and low skills, then you want to go for, I guess, the smallest deal you can, just to try and build that, build that confidence in those early days, if that makes sense. Now, what are some of these deals that you might be able to do? Well, I guess if you're doing the lower risk deals, then that's probably where your splitter blocks, your subdivisions are, that sort of thing. Maybe you might even do a build on one of those smaller projects. If you're wanting to do a medium risk deal, then that's probably where you're going to do either more in your subdivision process, or maybe you might do a 2 or a 3 pack townhouse project, for example. As you're taking on larger risk projects, that's where you're going to be going into 6 packs, 8 packs and more from a townhouse or a unit complex perspective. So you want to really make sure that your risk profile means that you're actually taking on a deal that is proportional to those risks as we go. Now, I can't see any questions along the way. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that as I'm prattling on, there's always a lag between me saying things and the questions coming back. I do very much encourage questions along the way. So I'm going to take the opportunity to just take a little bit of a sip, quench my thirst, give you guys a couple of chances to ask some questions, because I'm sure that there'll be plenty that come out of this as we go. Okay, no questions so far. Let's see how we progress. So I guess in those deals themselves, I guess there's a couple of different, as I said, a couple of different strategies that we could be going for. Units and townhouses, there's subdivisions, there's renos, there's all sorts of things like that. My guidance would be, if you're below that 100K mark, you really want to be taking on those low risk deals. So I would be, in doing a low risk deal, I'd be trying to do something along the line of a renovation, a subdivision, maybe a strata title of an existing complex in some way, shape or form. Maybe you could partner with someone who has already done a subdivision, and you might do a spec build. That's quite a low risk strategy as well. And then you're only really funding the construct if you get those on builder's terms or something along those lines. If you've got more than the 100K mark, that's where you could be taking on 3 or 4 lot land subdivisions. That's where you could be doing 2 and 3 lot townhouses, etc. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a concept there. What I do see commonly in other courses that are taught out there is that they say, you know, that they recommend going straight for, I guess, the townhouse type project and 6 packs and above. And I'm always overly cautious that that some people are taking on a little bit too much of a risk too early in the process. I would much rather see people build their confidence, build their nest egg, have a little bit of practice with a lower challenging project, build that capital, and then when they launch, then they can accelerate much faster. Otherwise, in the early days, they're I guess they're putting a lot of things at jeopardy, because if it goes right, it'll go spectacularly right, but if it goes wrong, it'll go spectacularly wrong. So I'm always cautious that sometimes people are taking on things a little bit too prematurely. Still don't see any questions coming from the crowd, which is most unusual for you guys. So if somebody could just give me a thumbs up that you're actually hearing me, that would be fantastic. I guess from a running a perspective, let's have a look at, as I said, if you're starting with no money, you might need to be doing a no money down type strategy. So so if you've got absolutely nothing in the kitty, you want to be looking at doing deal finding. You might want to do a thing called trading blocks, where you might get a block under option, and maybe you get 5 or 6 of them off one builder, off one developer, and you might flick those onto a builder and make a small cut along the process. I can see lots of thumbs up, so that's good. I had an angry face. Why is there an angry face? What did I do wrong? Oh, well, I'm not sure what it is, but I'm sure somebody will tell me in due course. Project management's another one where you can actually run somebody else's project, or you might find an existing vendor who has a developable block of land that they don't necessarily want to sell, but you might be able to project manage that for them. So that's a no money down type approach in that regard, or deal finding, where you can flick things on for a finder's fee. If you're once you start to go up the food chain, then the liquidity is the one part that's the most important, but then you need serviceability of the loan as well. So if you don't have the serviceability, that's back to where I said before with your budget. If you don't have the serviceability, then you need to be partnering with somebody else, or you need to have a more creative acquisition strategy. So there's, I guess, picking the strategy, and then there's how you actually acquire the property, 2 different parts to that process. And then I guess joint venturing with the vendor is a really good way to avoid that that serviceability type arrangement, if that makes sense. And then other people's money is the other way to help the serviceability side of things. This is very unusual that I'm not. Oh, I can see a couple of questions coming through. So Daniel says JV with the landowner. Yes, Daniel. So you can JV with them. There's a couple of elements to. I did cover JVs last week. There's a couple of elements to joint venturing with the landowner that you might want to make sure of. If they've owned it for quite some time, you want to make sure that that you've got control of the property. Not ownership. So if you own it, you have to pay for it. But if you've got control of it, that means you can actually run the project, have the ability to sign all of the documentation as you go. The big thing to be careful of is if it's in their name, then you don't want them to be able to go and sign documents in the sales process, maybe sell it for a price that you're not ready for, or maybe refuse to sell the property at all. So you want to make sure that you've actually got control if you're JVing with the existing landowner. So hopefully that helps there. This is a very very quiet crowd this week, guys. I'm quite surprised nothing's coming through. So so from the strategy, I guess back to the strategy side of things, the one thing that I really try to stress with everyone is just pick that one strategy. Whatever it is, every single strategy actually works, but you want to be, you don't want to be a jack of all trades and master of none. You actually genuinely want to have one strategy that you become an expert in and master that well. And it doesn't matter what that strategy is, so long as it's actually going to achieve that final goal at the end. And then once you've chosen what that strategy is, that then formulates what you do moving forward. So it's going to dictate where you go from a development perspective, because some suburbs are profitable with one strategy and not with another. It's going to dictate who you go and get to educate you or mentor you in the process, because they're going to be particular educators that are better in one strategy than the other. So picking that strategy right up front, very early in the process, is I guess the best way to actually achieve that. So I can see a question from Annie. Good one, Daniel. JV with the landowner. Is it an option? No, that's not an option, Annie. An option is, I guess, a different strategy. I actually covered options a couple of weeks ago on one of these lives. It's probably worth going back and watching that again. All of them are saved on our page, so the Property Developer Network page. If you want to go back there, you'll find all of our previous recordings, and there's definitely one there under options. So Ashish says, hey Rob, are there any implications for landowners with capital gains tax once you improve the site? So if you're keeping it in their name, Ashish, it really depends on how you've actually structured the deal. But the answer is that there will be tax implications if everything always stays in their name. If, however, you have done it in a delayed settlement process and you're purchasing a portion of the land, then you may be able to avoid that in the way you put your documentation together. My guidance would be that you go talk to your accountant and your solicitor based on the entity that they actually own it in, and based on the entity that you actually want to do it in, and see if there's a way to actually structure that together. But chances are, yes, there will be some tax implications on the existing landowner. Whether it's capital gains tax or whether it's GST, it really comes down to the intent. Now, their original intent in owning the property was probably long-term buy and hold, so capital gains is likely to be the one that hits them. However, your intent is to develop the land, and so it's really going to come down to, is it them developing it in their name, or is it you developing it in your name, or what those partnership arrangements say between you. So you can have some slightly different outcomes depending upon how that documentation is actually put together. And the best thing is to understand what the circumstances are for each party. And when you understand what the circumstances are, you can manipulate your documentation to suit the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So if hypothetically, if you had a look and you could do it in a way that had capital gains tax implications for them, or alternatively, you could do it with GST implications for you, have a look at the two differences in tax, and whichever one is the least, you might, and hypothetically, I'm just going to say in this instance, it might be the capital gains. You might say to them, look, if we keep it in your name, there's going to be a capital gains tax, but I will pay that tax because it's going to be cheaper than me doing it as GST on my behalf. So always do those calculations. It's going to depend on how long they've owned it, how much the uplift in value has been, what the profits in the deal are, all that sort of things. There's a lot of variables in that, but do the calculations both ways, work out the best way to structure that, and then have an upfront conversation with them, Ashish, and say, yes, there's going to be implications, but these are the implications. I'm going to consider that to be, I guess, a cost of the project. And we will get the project to actually fund those tax so that they're not actually out of pocket. Daniel says, in some slow markets like Melbourne, a strategy can be find houses on the market for a long time. Then, I'm not sure if you didn't finish the question there, Daniel. A strategy can be find houses on the market for a long time then. I think you've not finished the question, so I apologize there, Daniel. I don't quite understand the question. So I'm going to jump on to the next one, and then if you can complete that, I'll come back around to it again. Annie says, does the landowner finance the development? And what is a fair percentage deal arrangement? So typically, no, the landowner would not finance the arrangement unless you're doing that in a project management perspective. So if you're project managing it, yes, they would. If you're joint venturing with it, no, it would be typically you that would run that, Annie. So hopefully that helps. So James says, have you seen stca.com.au? I've used it for quick feasibilities on properties. So the answer is no, I have not. I will go and check that out. I'm going to say, James, that any feasibility software that you get, and there's tons of really good stuff out there, including the one that I sell, which is QuickFeaso. The feasibility software itself is not enough. It really comes down to your ability to assess the property, the issues and challenges that you're going to have on the project. If you don't identify the issues and challenges that need to be resolved and cost them out, then your FESO is going to look fantastic, but it's not actually going to be accurate. Equally, you need to understand the sale of the finished product, what that's actually going to be. And again, if you can get the top and the tail of that process worked out accurately, then the feasibility you can do on the back of a napkin. The software is great, but what I found is too many people jump into feasibilities in a great level of detail way too early. They try to gather every single issue and every single challenge up front. They spend days and days and sometimes even weeks analysing a site, only to find that the deal has either gone or didn't stack up or something along those lines. So the FESO software that I build called QuickFeaso follows a toll gating methodology process that I teach in my courses, which is a 10-minute check, a 2-hour check, and then I guess a full detailed due diligence check. So you basically get to a point where in a toll gate you can say, is there enough profit in the deal to even justify going to the next level of detail? What we're trying to do is to do as minimal work as possible early in the piece so that we can look at as many properties as possible. But if it's not even accurate within an order of magnitude, then it's not worth going, I guess, too much further in the process. But that said, I will go check out stca.com.au, but no, I haven't seen it. Kamal says, Kamal's just joined. Hi, Kamal, how are you? They charge $99. James, I guess the cost is not the point. I guess that's not, I guess, necessarily the cheapest. You could, rather than charging $99 for one feasibility, you could spend anywhere from $150 to $800 and actually own the software forever, and then you could do as many feasibilities as you like. So without having seen it, I don't know what they actually cover in that, but I'd be I'd be more interested in you doing the full FISO yourself and learning how the process works than paying someone else to do it. Daniel says, work out why the house didn't sell and then come in and reno or develop with the paperwork to allow you to do so. Yes, Daniel. Okay, I understand your question now. Yes, that is a good strategy. You can absolutely, I guess, find reasons to understand why it hasn't actually sold. See if there's an opportunity there to work with the vendor to resolve whatever issue it is as to why it's been on the market for so long. And then if you can add some value through the process, then you can partner with them and split the profits from there. So yes, staggered options, settlement and settlements. Yes, that's also an option, Daniel. But if you do a staggered option, so I'm just going to explain that for the others. I'm assuming that you're referencing specifically trying to, I guess, pick up some land off an existing vendor and just sell their back land, for example. So if you stagger the option, you can buy just the front half or just the back half, or you could buy the entire lot off them, and you may be able to flick the one half of the property on in that staggered option type arrangement without actually triggering a double stamp duty event. So that helps you out, but it still doesn't help the existing vendor out because the land has been developed and the parcel separated, so they will have some tax obligations in that. So Annie says, JV with the landowner, how does owner builder apply? Do they need to hold and live in for a number of years? So owner builder changes for every single state. I'm going to be because every state is slightly different in how they do that. But generally, owner builder only allows you to build one property in anywhere between 3 and a 5 year period. So you may have the ability to do that, the owner builder one time, and then you're locked out for the next 3 to 5 years, depending upon what state you're in. So I'd be very cautious in doing that. You can only also build a single property, Annie. So if you're trying to do a 2-lot subdivision, then you can only build one of them, for example. So so yes, it is an option, but you're probably actually better to actually engage an actual builder who's professional and knows how to do it. They'll probably do it in, I guess, a lot more efficiently and effectively than you would as an owner builder on the first go. And then you can learn from the process as you're watching them through. If you're really wanting to be a builder, then I would go get a full builder's license rather than, I guess, try to do a one-off owner builder type arrangement. Annie then says, your FISO software sounds good. Where's the link, please? It's on my website, Annie. I'll actually throw it in here, www.com.au/whoops. This is off the top of my head. I'm 99% sure that that's the link, so hopefully that helps. Yeah, it's way back in time, Annie. We actually, I spent 20 odd years in IT, and I actually developed the software as a smartphone app to sit on your phone. We had it out there in the market for, I'm going to say, a good 4 or 5 years. We had nearly 4,000 people actually using that software, and the biggest piece of feedback that we had was, this is fantastic, but I don't want to use it on my phone. I want to use it on my desktop, and can you give it to me in Excel? So after spending thousands and thousands of dollars building it as a smartphone app, we then dumbed it down and brought it back to a spreadsheet. So how's that for funny, hey? Anyway, that's pretty much all the questions I can see there, guys. We're about 40 minutes in. Has anyone else got any questions on the topic of choosing your strategy? Can't see any questions coming through. I'll give you a couple of minutes. And whilst we're waiting, I'll just remind anyone in Brisbane wanting to come to our meetup this month, because of Easter weekend, we have actually brought that forward 1 week. So that is going to be next weekend is the meetup in Brisbane. Failing that, we've actually got our very first meetup in Melbourne going to be on the 4th of May. So very much looking forward to that. We've already got a town planner and a Real Deal actually going to go there. We're about to announce that publicly to the world. And we've also got some really excellent speakers lined up for the next couple of months there in Melbourne as well. So yes. Can this Feezo software be used and presented to a lender? So yes, it can, Annie. There is a particular page where I guess on one of the tabs it actually breaks down the Feezo in a very user-friendly way to give to your bank, etc. So yes, it can be, and I do it fairly regularly, whether it be giving it to a bank, whether it be giving it to an investor, something along those lines. And it breaks it down without seeing all the variables that actually go into it. It's just a nice, easy one-pager. So hopefully that helps. Margaret says, thanks. Oh, thanks, Margaret. I didn't even see you sneak in. So hello. Okay, can't see any more questions, guys. So as we're at the 40-minute mark, if we don't get anything in the next couple of minutes, then I might call it a day. Okay, well, Cody has just joined. So hi, Cody, how are you, mate? We're just coming to the very end. So, thank you very much for joining, but you might have to, when we hit end here in about a minute or so, you might have to just rewind and replay the video. So, but welcome aboard, mate. Okay, well, as I haven't heard any more questions coming through, I'm going to call that a night. So thank you very much, folks. Looking forward to catching, if you're in Brisbane, looking forward to catching you up this week at the Comesley Hotel. Otherwise, we'll see you again next Sunday at 5 o'clock Brisbane time. Thanks, folks, and see you for now. And thank you, Annie. I appreciate that. I'll give that a like. Bye, guys.